Who we are today is not the same person we were yesterday. When tomorrow comes around, we will be someone new as well. But things are never truly new. Patterns of temperament and behavior have existed as long as people have walked this earth. Rather than becoming a brand new person, we transition from one pattern to another. This process is governed by both the external world and our internal response to the stimuli. The process of how this works and how they interact with templates of psychological experience is a rabbit hole in and of itself, one that we will be exploring with the next founding member of the Psychonauts. Today we break down Cassie O'Pia and her mental world, Cassie's Collection. Inside of the Hypnodome, Raz finds the astrolabe. It is, however, covered in vines and swarming with bees. Yet another set of obstacles needed before he and Ford can attempt to work on the dam in Nona's head. Two paths, one on the left, one on the right. Let's start by grabbing a can of smoke and going up the left path. The smoke keeps the bees at bay during the trek. The swarm acts as a deterrent to visitors, maintaining an isolated haven for the occupant in the house that overlooks the gulch. Earlier on in the game, Lizzie tells an urban legend of the Green Needle Witch, a local boogeyman that captures children in the woods. The structure at the top of the hill could be considered the witch's cabin. Inside, Raz finds himself face to face with the witch herself. It quickly becomes apparent that this is not some malevolent figure, but a flesh and blood person, Cassie O'Pia herself. A hermit in the gulch whom the interns tell stories about. They are oblivious to the truth. Rather than jump into her mental world right away, we are going to do things a bit out of order and dive into her history right now. How she went from founding member of the Psychonauts to a woman locked away in the woods and refusing to take visitors. The quickest way is to explore the mental vault entitled Protect the Queen. After the Battle of Grulovia, the survivors all dealt with the grief of losing Helmet and the shame of failure differently. All of them had their own form of PTSD to contend with. For Cassie, her mental vault shows her initial attempts to surround herself with others. After a traumatic event, the need to be alone is common. A degree of isolation gives the individual time to process the event, but seeking support from those you trust can be very helpful after this period is over. Unfortunately, it does not work for Cassie. The trusted group she used to surround herself has slipped away. First, the entire group loses Helmet. After, we see her attempt to reach out to the others. Otto is too distracted with the opening of the mother lobe to give her any mind. Compton is drawn into this and eventually goes to psycho-isolation for his own reasons. Bob drowned himself in a bottle. The last of the old crowd was Ford, but with his mind shattered, he was not of use to anyone. She was truly alone, suffering with no one to turn to for help. At this point, she packed up her bags and left, heading into the woods to tend to her bees. Her initial attempt to surround herself with the others failed, little by little reinforcing the instinct to be isolated in the aftermath of a trauma. This inability to find support and decision to self-isolate set up a series of dominoes that concluded with the creation of two mental constructs, the Queen Bee and the Librarian. While both are two sides of the same coin, they are semantically different. Both reinforce her current condition, a behavioral pattern known as social isolation, easily defined as a state of complete or near-complete lack of contact between an individual and society. Let's focus on the Queen Bee first before jumping into the level properly. During Raz and Cassie's conversation, she admits to playing into the myth of the Green Needle Witch. She claims that her motivation is one of guardianship, to protect the Gulch from outsiders since it is a sacred place. However, this is not her only motivation. In fact, I believe she completely misrepresents her true intentions. Evidence for this is found directly within the pages of the book in her mental world, the Concilium Apem, or the Council of Bees. In these sections, Raz becomes 2D and platforms around various letters and illustrations. The book itself is written in Latin and largely is ignored by the player. However, after finding a translation, I can see why this is probably the most relevant detail that gets to the root of her current situation. Once, a wasp said she would destroy the hive. 6 strong bees began to buzz. The first bee told a story. It was bad. The second sang a song of peace. The wasp did not love him. The third asked for help from the ants, and they refused. The fourth used a vine, but she broke loose. The 5th bee tried to freeze the wasp. She did not notice. The 6th finally won the day, but he lost his mind. The first bee is the most destitute. She was the first to fail the many. She will build herself up stronger. She discarded her mercy upon the shelf. She left the hive and made another, but she is alone in her new hive. She frightens away outsiders and lives there to this day. Because of her close tie to bees, Cassie's law of associations tends to draw symbolic parallels with them. The hive being the Psychonauts, the wasp being Maligula, and the bees being the Psychic Six. The important detail, however, is the fate of the first bee in the story, the one representing Cassie. She considers herself the first to fail. She wants to discard her mercy upon the shelf since that is what, in her mind, caused her failure. This leads to the creation of the librarian locking away nicer parts of her mind. Her new hive is just a swarm that she can psychically control, very much like a real queen does. As a result, they reflect her own unconscious desires despite being separate from her, a projection of her unspoken will. This is especially interesting when Cassie's initial response to Raz about Ford's return is to immediately drop what she is doing to help. However, the swarm confronts her, telling her she cannot and has to remain isolated. It can be argued that by having the swarm force her to attend to the queen, Cassie herself has become a drone in the hive, no longer in control, being told what to do by her coping strategy rather than being in control of herself. It can be difficult to change patterns of behavior. Through repetition, we develop habits. When we associate thoughts, emotions, and behaviors in certain patterns over and over, our brain develops a habit, similar to the Rogerian filter we discussed in Kruller's correspondence. We can sometimes become a passenger in this process, a drone in the hive, a servant to the queen rather than the queen itself. This pattern becomes stronger each time we walk this mental path. What we see with Cassie here is her innate desire to help Raz. It is obvious that the moment she hears Ford is back, all she hears is her support system is not as lost as she presumed. Without hesitating, she moves to leave her hermit's hideaway. However, since she has reinforced social isolation as a maladaptive coping strategy for so long, it is a hard habit to break. The bees drag her away, forcing her to tend to the queen. Since the swarm obeys her unconscious will, it is her coping strategy refusing to let her go, to obey the habit formed by her neural network. For more information on how to break out of this cycle, we discuss it more in our previous video on Hollis Forsyth. Unfortunately, it is not only the swarm that keeps her here. There are other external factors that help to contribute to her situation. Things that, for lack of a better word, enable her behavior. One of which is the self-deception. Cassie tells Raz she plays into the urban legend of the witch to protect the gulch, but in her own mind, the story she wrote about herself confirms she does it so that she can be alone. It serves her desire to remain socially isolated, by scaring away people who may come calling, even those who may wish to help. She may not even realize she lied to the young intern. After all, it is easy to lie to ourselves. Another external factor is what she does to occupy her time. Beekeeping certainly helps to focus her mind on a repetitive task, distracting her from what she really needs. Here, among her bees, she can engage in one form of maladaptive coping. She is permitted to hyperfixate on her beekeeping. Hyperfixation is defined as an intense concentration on an activity while neglecting everything else. This, in and of itself, is not a bad thing. It can be channeled into a worthy pursuit, such as a particular field of academic study or a creative endeavor. However, challenges can emerge when basic needs are ignored. It is not uncommon when in a state of hyperfixation to forget to eat or sleep. It may lead the individual to neglect personal relationships, which can especially be detrimental if the reason for the behavior is a trauma or anxiety response. Feeling emotionally disconnected is another side effect. You see, by itself, beekeeping is not a bad thing. However, it facilitates her to remain socially isolated, emotionally disconnected, and ultimately not return to her old hive and the support she truly needs. This hyperfixation on beekeeping acts to enable her current situation to her own detriment. As you have all probably noticed, I keep pointing out different behaviors or thought patterns that enable Cassie's maladaptive coping strategy. Considering this level's new enemy type is the Enabler, it is a perfect time to talk about them. From a gameplay perspective, Enablers provide a protective shield around other mental enemies. As long as the Enabler is linked to this enemy, it cannot be defeated. In-game, this tells us that the coping strategies we have previously discussed serve to reinforce and protect the doubts, the bad ideas, and regrets, making it harder to get rid of them. From a real-life perspective, enablers are another thing that can be both positive or negative. By its purest definition, they are simply a person or thing that facilitates something or makes it possible. Using that definition, this entity should have two forms in the mental world, two faces. One that reinforces positive and one that reinforces negative thoughts and behaviors. Sometimes this is done consciously, and sometimes the individual acting in this role has no idea they are doing it. For convenience, let's look at this graphic to break this all down. The behavior can be intentional or unintentional, and it can lead to positive or negative outcomes. Semantically speaking, the term enabler is neutral. However, currently, it is a charged word that carries a negative connotation. Because of this, when the enabling behavior leads to a positive outcome, we will use the word empowering instead. The trouble is, knowing when we are enabling and when we are empowering is not as easy as it sounds. A friend may accidentally go along with one of your bad ideas. They are doing it with the intention of being supportive, or they truly believe it will lead you to the best outcome. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it does not. So they think they are empowering you, but are actually enabling you. None of us have a crystal ball, and it is impossible to know what the ultimate outcome will be. Our involvement in another person's decision-making, regardless of our motivations, does not have a guaranteed outcome. This becomes more complicated when we realize it is not only other people that act in this capacity. Our own thoughts and self-talk can enable or empower us. All of us do things that we believe are in our best interest. But again, we don't have a crystal ball and cannot fully predict what the outcome will be. In general, people will settle on what reduces anxiety or satisfies desires in the short term without considering the long-term effects. Cassie's actions of isolating herself and hyperfixating on her beekeeping certainly reduces anxiety and produces a reward for her behavior pattern. A jar of honey, something sweet. A treat to encourage this behavior to continue. However, her problem is not being solved. This can be summed up by Freud's pleasure-pain principle, which we will discuss more once we head to the greenhouse and meet Bob Zanato. It seems appropriate that before we officially head into Cassie's mind, we get one more topic out of the way. It relates directly to why the Battle of Grulovia was such a strong psychic influence on the survivors, about how external events and our internal response to them shapes our behavior patterns, our personality, and our temperament. The theory of behaviorism. To quote from Dr. Serhat Kurt's paper, which I have linked below, behaviorism is a psychological theory based around understanding observable behavior. The theory posits that adjusting or manipulating the environment of the subject will cause them to react in observable ways. Behaviorists consider the subject to be passive, and learning being something that happens to them, rather than an active participant in the learning. End quote. To distill this down, this theory takes from the nurture camp of human development, that the world acts upon us as an individual, that we as animals have programmed responses to stimuli which are 1, predictable, and 2, can be manipulated. In the context of Psychonauts, the Battle of Grulovia was a major stimulus that affected the Psychic Six. Several psychologists flirted with the idea of behaviorism, and it evolved over time before being named. Most famously, Ivan Pavlov with the bell and the dog experiment. Another being Edward Thorndike, who did work with training animals to perform tasks. The individual I want to focus on, however, is John B. Watson, the man who popularized the theory. One of his experiments illustrates the connection between traumatic stimuli, how it is internalized emotionally, how the neural network is affected, and how that mental pathway expresses itself in observed behavior. Dr. Watson believed that if he had access to a person from birth, regardless of background, he could program them to be anything he wanted. By use of classical conditioning, he could create stimuli and reinforce behavioral responses. In essence, programming a person to behave specific ways when exposed to stimuli out in the world. Very similar to how Cassie experienced a traumatic stimuli and it resulted in a series of reinforced behavioral responses, leading to a pattern of self-isolation and aversion to changing that state. Even when she wants to leave with Raz, she unconsciously stops due to having conditioned herself to remain isolated. In his famous experiment, Watson took a 9-month-old child which was given the pseudonym Little Albert. His goal was to program the infant to be afraid of a lab rat. In phase 1 of this trial, Little Albert was placed in the room with a white rat among other stimuli. The child showed no fear of the animal. Every time the boy tried to touch the rat, the lab assistant would strike a metal rod with a hammer. The stimuli scared the kid and caused him to cry. As this was repeated over and over, Little Albert began to run away from the rat because he had been trained to expect a fear response in the form of a loud noise. Weeks later, the boy began to show fear responses from anything that reminded him of the rat. This included the white lab coats, teddy bears, or even a white beard. His fear was successfully programmed into him, and it was generalized to be experienced with anything similar to the object of his fear. In this scenario, the rat is the object, the loud noise is the stimuli, and the fear is the emotional reflex. Over time, the fear became associated with the rat and not the loud noise, the child unable to separate the two. Let's take a look at this through the lens of Cassie. The Battle of Grulovia acted as a massive stimuli which summoned negative emotion. These emotions were internalized. Her attempt to receive support from the others failed, which only reinforced the instinct for isolation. Her hyperfixation on beekeeping further reinforced this isolation. The creation of the queen bee created an external factor which reinforced this even further. Each enabling action became another hammer banging on the metal pipe, training her to have a certain behavior pattern, one that kept her isolated in this house in a pattern of maladaptive coping. The theory of behaviorism has various criticisms, not only because the act of psychologically programming people against their will is immoral, but it neglects an entire facet of psychology. In a way, Dr. Watson tried to reduce human behavior to simply a math equation, a reductionist philosophy that ignores the inner workings of the mind. He believed we are simply machines with no ghost in it. It reduces us to mere victims of our upbringing, rather than heroes in our own story. We have the power to confront the dragons in our head and fight against our own impulses, our own negative patterns. In practice, behavior, personality, and temperament are informed by other things that reside within the psyche. Things that cannot be measured by scientific means, but ultimately do influence us. Since we cannot measure these things, easiest way to explain them is through stories. Through archetypes. Lucky for us, inside Cassie's head is a library full of such stories. A teacher who will soon give Raz a lecture on this exact topic. Finally, it is time for us to toss the side portal and check out Cassie's collection. On the inside, it quickly becomes apparent that the place is themed after a library. Books of all kinds stock the mental shelves. These include fantasy tales, classical poetry, and educational books of math and science. The fiction and non-fiction that occupies her mental bookshelves end up being every concept and story she has been exposed to in life. After all, isn't that what the personal unconscious is? A collection of things that have been acquired since birth. Memories, emotions, stories, knowledge, even things that are forgotten, repressed, or only perceived subliminally. One example we see can be found in certain figments, specifically a series of animals: a dog, sheep, monkey, dragon, rabbit, ox, pig, tiger, rooster, horse, snake, and a rat. Due to her country of origin, Cassie has figments of the entire Chinese zodiac inside her head, a holdover from her cultural upbringing. If the personal unconscious is a sponge, it soaks up anything it is exposed to, collected as a new book and filed on the shelf. Repressed memories may be in a restricted section buried in the basement. Accessing these requires a key that you either threw away or lost at some point in the past. The mental world is divided into multiple sections, each of which contain a paper cutout of Cassie herself. The drama of the level involves one of these paper dolls growing too big and usurping control of the place. The librarian. Earlier we discussed that the queen bee is the external representation of a mental process. After falling into a cycle of maladaptive coping, Cassie becomes a drone to the queen rather than the queen herself. Well, the librarian is another mental construct, an internal one. This personality reflects the thinking found in Concilium Apum. In the book, Cassie wrote that she put the nicer parts of herself on the shelf, abandoning them so a more dominant and protective personality can assume control. After difficult times, it is common to place a mental suit of armor around ourselves, to develop a new personality designed to keep us safe. We harden ourselves, believing that if we were this way back then, the damage would never have been done, that we would have been kept safe from the things that harmed us. Armor, by its very nature, are designed to be worn for battle, then taken off, not to be worn forever. By doing this, you keep the bad from hurting you, certainly, but nothing good comes either. For Cassie, by wearing this metaphorical armor, she is separating herself from other aspects of her personality, ones she feels are not useful to her well-being or the well-being of others. As a result, the librarian has taken control by collecting them up and locking them away. Each personality is its own paper doll. While we witness 4 within the world directly, there are likely far, far more. One for each situation she finds herself in. But the question arises, which of these is the real Cassie?
The real Cassie. Important challenges in our lives can cause us to create entirely new identities for ourselves, sometimes summoning powerful archetypes from our unconscious mind. The hero, the explorer, the shadow. My special talent allows me to summon up whatever archetype I need to survive my current situation.
This topic requires us to leave the measurable field of psychology that Dr. Watson utilized. We will discuss one of the psychologists that he rejected, things that could not be observed empirically but was understood through a more abstract lens, Carl Jung and the theory of archetypes. Until this point in the series, I haven't really touched upon the field of Jungian psychology. While the brain tumbler does take Raz and Sasha into a mental location called the collective unconscious, not much is made of this, and these ideas are rarely revisited by name. But since teacher Cassie directly brings it up, I feel it is fair to explore. Unlike Dr. Watson, who focused exclusively on external stimuli and measurable behavior, Carl Jung focused on the inner function of the mind, more specifically, the unconscious contents that reside within. In the game, the collective unconscious is described as a location where all minds meet, a nexus point for Raz that allows him to revisit worlds after completion. However, that is a misrepresentation of the collective unconscious. It is actually described as a part of the human psyche that contains shared mental concepts, something universal to the human experience. This is what differentiates it from the personal unconscious that we discussed earlier. Think of it like a hard drive and an operating system. When you buy a new computer, it comes preloaded with an OS. After you boot it up, you begin to save things onto the hard drive. The contents of the computer that you fill up is the personal unconscious, the nurture part of the human experience. The operating system, though, is the same for everyone who buys a computer of that brand. It exists before you get it out of the box. It is the nature part of the human experience. As the theory goes, upon birth, every newborn has the contents of the collective unconscious programmed into them, so to speak. According to Jung, this part of the psyche is occupied by instincts and archetypes. For those who have a dog, have you ever noticed them walk in a circle before laying down? Why is this? It is something learned by the dog's ancestors. an instinctual behavior that served a purpose at one point. Specifically, it allowed the animal to fully survey the surroundings in a 360 to check for predators. It also would stamp down the grass and other vegetation to make a more comfortable place to rest. But who taught this behavior to a dog who has never lived in the wild and needed to worry about predators? It is instinct, programmed into the animal at birth. As humans, we have our own sets of instincts, some of which may be vestigial, just like the behavior we discussed with the dog example. Besides this, though, archetypes are the other contents of the collective unconscious. These are directly mentioned by Cassie and are more relevant to her mental world. Jung suggested that archetypes were archaic forms of innate human knowledge passed down from our ancestors. Using simpler terms, they are universal patterns of human behavior, each represented by a character image that could be from a storybook. Think of them like templates or macros of human behavioral patterns. The archetypal image itself acts as an abstract effigy representing an entire philosophical concept. A few mentioned by Cassie is the hero, the explorer, the shadow, the trickster, the old mentor, and a warrior. It is easy to notice these archetypes when consuming media. Once you notice the pattern, it becomes second nature to recognize them. The hero archetype, usually our main character who leaves the ordinary world and goes on an adventure. Along the way, there is a meeting or relationship with the old wise mentor, a figure who grants knowledge or talismans of great power. Usually, the mentor leaves the story to allow the hero to act alone. The shadow contains many things. Some are unknown to even ourselves, the shameful things we refuse to accept, or the repressed parts of our psyche. In literature, we see it generally as a dark reflection of the protagonist. Frodo travels with Gollum, an example of what he may become if he allows the ring to corrupt his heart completely. In the cave, Luke confronts his shadow in the form of Vader, an example of what he will become if he falls to the dark side. Tom Riddle has a very similar upbringing in an orphanage and shows what Harry could have become if the events of his life led down a different path. As I said, it is easy to recognize these archetypes in fantastical literature, but we don't often apply the same logic to ourselves or people we meet in our lives. The wise mentor can be a man working at a gas station who helps us through a difficult time. The hero is us. The people we meet every day can be archetypal figures for us, usually in small ways, but sometimes their impact is profound. On occasion, though, we must assume the role of an archetype in someone else's life. After all, they are the heroes of their own story too. For the shadow, technology plays a role. It is common for people to treat another one way when behind the safety of a computer screen, and a different way when face to face. Feeling anonymous when behind any form of mask is an easy way to let our shadow out to play. Cassie acknowledges these archetypes within her own psyche. Based upon her situation, she resonates with one of them at a time, allowing this behavior pattern or personality to become her persona. In the Jungian sense, the persona is the face we show the world. On the outside, nothing appears to have changed, but everything is different. Inside her mind, though, each personality takes on the form of a unique paper doll. As mentioned earlier, Cassie has 4 that we witness firsthand: the teacher, the writer, the counterfeiter, and the librarian. By use of projection, she pushes one of these to act as her persona for a time. This is the ability Raz learns in this world. However, his is more childish and maybe something he has ignored since the events of his life forced him to grow up too quickly. Let's take a moment to reflect on ourselves. Cassie claims that we all take on different personas based upon who we are with. Speaking from experience, I am a different person when I'm with my boss versus my coworkers, a different person with my sister versus my parents, a different person with my friends versus when I'm here on YouTube with you all. I'm sure everyone watching can relate. This is why, in my opinion, the most important archetype to develop a relationship with is one that Cassie does not mention: the shapeshifter. Cassie's ability to constantly shift between these various personalities for the purpose of survival classifies her as a shapeshifter. Unfortunately, life is not a one-size-fits-all. Sometimes changing our perspective or personality in different environments is necessary. Staying the same all the time may cause us to hit a few roadblocks. If I spoke to my boss like I speak to my friends, I'd be fired. Understanding when to project certain behaviors and when not to is an important skill to learn, one that's picked up with experience. Within Cassie's collection, the paper dolls represent her different archetypal personalities, each with a life of its own. However, these are not the only mental contents we see. Some are people she knows, some is knowledge she attained in her life, others are stories she has read. Let's discuss these individually. The first and most numerous classification of these figures are fictional characters. They are found in the Children's Corner and Literature Lane. After experiencing a story, the characters take on a life of their own. Inside our heads they remain. We can summon them forth to relive the relationship. However, how we mentally recall these characters is filtered through our own perception of them. If we took the time to analyze each of the paper dolls, we can see some of Cassie's personality leaking through, namely the obsession with puns. At the end of the day, anyone exposed to a piece of art does not see the same thing. Each person alters the material before placing that book on the mental shelf. We do a bit of rewriting unconsciously before internalizing the data. This concept is called apperception. It can be defined as the mental process by which a perception or an idea is transformed by the individual's past experience and assimilated into the mind. In essence, new information is transformed by our personal ideology and prior life experience before it is internalized. It is like wearing a pair of glasses. Everything we see is filtered through a lens before our eyes process the information. What we see is based upon what is out there, but slightly different since everyone wears a different prescription. This does not only apply to literature. Each of the combatants of the Battle of Grulovia took something different from the event. Their apperception of the battle led them to internalize the emotional impact in different ways. For Cassie, it led to her social and emotional isolation. It created the queen bee and the librarian. The next major type of paper doll in Cassie's collection is up in the attic of the lobby. Up here, the figures represent the other 6 founding members. However, their personalities do not necessarily match up with reality. Let's go through them one by one to see her apperception of the others. Ford is the first we come across. Right behind him is a figment of bacon, showing that Cassie is fully aware of his obsession.
I was brilliant back in the day, but now I'm a little, all over the place. But I'm sure if Cassie keeps tending her beehives, I'll come back to my old self someday.
Cassie acknowledges that Ford was brilliant, but that is the extent of his personality. His words are not something the real Ford would say. Instead, dialogue is there to enable her coping strategy. Somewhere along the way, she convinced herself that Ford will come back on his own. She could keep hyperfixating on her beekeeping and did not need to assist in the process. Luckily, Raz took care of the problem. He was an outside influence helping despite Cassie hiding herself away. Another example of why a support system is important. The next one we come across is Auto Mentalis. We learn that Cassie had a low opinion of him, believing him to be narcissistic and kind of ignorant on topics other than machines. Up next is Helmut and Bob. Cassie appreciated Helmut's ability to help others see the beauty in life rather than the dark parts. However, she really did not know Bob. His words more general knowledge rather than an understanding of him.
Probably something to do with plants, I'll bet. I was always really into that kind of stuff.
Hey, Bob! I'm a friend of your great niece.
I have a niece? Well, glad she's great.
We can be around the same people for years and not really know them. Therefore, our perception of them is largely void of proper detail. Compton only expresses how he is lost without Cassie, that she acted as a stabilizing force for him. There may be a touch of regret here, knowing that her closest friend is struggling, but not knowing the details because she isolated herself. In the back corner, situated near some emotional baggage, rests Lucretia Mux. It is revealed that Cassie attempted to form a deeper friendship with her, but Lucy was too distracted by Ford to notice or care. At least that is what Cassie believed was the cause of the situation. Largely, what we learn is that Cassie had wrestled with the question of why Lucy changed, not fully understanding what happened. It concludes with her saying that people are complicated. As the audience, we have a deeper understanding of these characters. It is easy to see where Cassie's apperception of these people are accurate and where they are not. As the saying goes, perception is not reality. If we acknowledge that apperception filters the stimuli before being internalized, then we must also accept that what we internalize may or may not accurately reflect what we witnessed. It's the reason why snap judgments are often proven to be wrong once new data is accumulated. If the apperception between object and observer is accurate, there is no problem. It aligns with reality. However, if it is inaccurate, then we can apply characteristics to a person or thing that are false. Usually they align with some form of behavior pattern or archetype that we have experienced in the past. As we discussed earlier, the theory of archetypes posits the presence of patterns of emotional and behavioral experience. It is common to generalize perceptions of one thing and apply it to unrelated things. In psychological terms, generalization means the process whereby people transfer what they have learned in one context to another situation. In addition, transference is defined as a phenomenon in which one directs feelings or desires towards someone who is not the original source of those feelings. In both cases, we apply opinions to a thing that is unwarranted. Remember little Albert? His programmed fear of the rat was generalized onto anything that reminded him of the rat. In the scenario between Cassie and Otto, it would be possible if she generalized her apperception of Otto onto all engineers, applying what she knows about him onto other similar people. This does not seem to be the case within the context of the story, as we see no evidence Cassie does this. But it is a behavior that is not uncommon. Sometimes it is harmless, like having a protective feeling over a friend who reminds you of your younger sibling. Other times it is self-destructive, like remaining in an abusive relationship because of a fear of abandonment caused by one's parent leaving at a young age. It is better to be conscious of this tendency so that we don't accidentally transfer false perceptions onto a thing that leads to a negative situation. The first step in avoiding a trap is being aware of its existence. As Lucy's cutout mentioned, people are complicated. Every one of us is not defined by a single behavioral archetype. We are all the shapeshifter who shows different faces in different situations. In order to truly understand what makes someone tick, we must develop a relationship with as many of these archetypes as possible. This way we have a more nuanced perspective of others. This brings us to the final classification of cutouts in this mental world. That would be Cassie's archetypes. In this chapter, we will look at each of them and the history that surrounds them, starting with the beginning and working forward. Cassie's history begins in Shanghai, where she was abandoned by her parents. In order to survive, she developed a personality that the story calls Counterfeiter Cassie. This is the thick-skinned and tough archetype that she adopted to deal with her current situation. We see the beginning of the story in her second mental vault entitled Cassie's Escape Plan, shifting into the role of a criminal. Cassie worked for Fanny Flats, printing fake money. This led to her being arrested and questioned by the police. At another point in the level, it becomes apparent that after snitching on Fanny to save herself, the police decided to blackmail the crime lord for money rather than arrest her. In the mental vault, we see something interesting. In the second slide, the police are portrayed as generally normal. However, she then realizes that these particular officers have no intention of upholding their oath. In her mind, she superimposes the image of a snake onto them. Before, she thought they were there to help. Now, she knows better. For her, the image of the serpent is an archetype for one who will deceive and betray. I feel it is good to pause here and make an observation. From what we know, Cassie has experienced a series of events which led to her isolation long before the Battle of Grulovia. First, she was abandoned by her parents. Then, she survived under a dangerous figure that she fought to escape. Then, she was betrayed by the local police. After finally experiencing a family for the first time with the Psychonauts, they were all taken away from her as well in the aftermath of the battle. Her entire life has been pushing her towards this little by little. After one betrayal and abandonment after another, the world trained her that the only person she could rely on is herself. It is probably why the story portrays a codependent relationship between Cassie and Compton. Fear of abandonment and betrayal can cause one to latch onto a person that makes them feel safe. Ultimately, their relationship was just as therapeutic for her as it was for him. So when she lost him, that was it. One final bang of the metal pipe with a hammer. All she could do is go into the woods to be alone. The counterfeiter, however, still shows some of her self-preserving tendencies. Throughout Raz's first encounter with her, the counterfeiter is suspicious of the boy. Her distrust is generalized to him as well, at least at first. She requests that the intern collect 3 pieces of evidence for her. Afterwards, with everything she needs to get out of town, she learns to trust him and joins Raz on the journey to stop the librarian. At this point in Cassie's history, she shifts from the counterfeiter to the writer. If she was going to escape Shanghai and the reprisal from Fanny Flats, she needed money to leave. This is when we return to the second half of her mental vault. Instead of being a criminal, she adopted a new personality and set of behaviors. Writing the book, then using the printing presses at Fanny's shop to print it, sending it to a publisher, which is printed en masse. We see long lines of people trying to purchase her book, which led to her windfall of money. Cassie used these funds to charter a boat and leave the dangers of home behind. In the level, we see a piece of mental baggage right on the docks where she departed Shanghai. In my interpretation, this particular piece of baggage contained her fear of Fanny Flats, the anxiety over being betrayed by the police, the looming threat of reprisal over snitching on a crime lord. But now that she is leaving, she is free to leave all that baggage behind on the docks and sail away. The third archetype of Cassie's is the teacher. This is the one who instructed Raz on how to use the projection ability, the one who gave us our lecture on the theory of archetypes and set us off on this trail of thought. The interesting thing about the teacher is she seems to be the one to develop new projections, new paper dolls. She bears the greatest metacognition from what we have seen. Metacognition is defined as an awareness of one's thought processes and an understanding of the patterns behind them. This seems to be a requirement in the process of developing a projection. With all 3 personalities collected together, Raz hands them over to the librarian. As she locks them away, she claims that they are now safe and sound. When Raz asks for his reward, requesting that she get rid of the bees, she locks him away too, claiming that if he is scared, it is better to stay and never leave the library. We witness another example of her belief that it is best to isolate oneself away from the things that may harm us. But now that the other 3 personalities are together, they are ready to begin their counterattack against the rogue personality.
Well, that tears it. I hate to damage a book, of course. We're not going to let you control us anymore. Oh, and which one of you thinks you should be in charge? None of you could stop Maligula. None of you could protect your friends. I am the real Cassie O'Pia.
We discussed earlier that the librarian is the new queen of the hive. She put on a suit of armor to guard herself against future pain, against future failure. After all, you can't fail if you don't try anything. She is the internal reflection of the queen bee we see on the outside. This behavior pattern has usurped conscious control from Cassie. Bringing back the theories of Carl Jung, there is a term that defines this phenomenon: possession. According to him, psychological possession denotes a peculiar state of mind characterized by the fact that certain psychic contents, the so-called complexes, take over control of the total personality in place of the ego to such a degree that the free will of the ego is suspended. In simpler terms, when we are possessed by a personality, we lose control of ourselves. The rational part of our mind becomes lost and a programmed behavior pattern takes over. Before entering her mind, Raz invited Cassie to join him and go to Ford. Her conscious self at first wanted to join, but the personality which has possessed her is in control, a metaphorical demon we see as the queen bee or the librarian. Since it has possessed her and replaced her ego, she cannot go against it. Immediately her rational mind surrenders and follows the directive of the dominant personality. This phenomenon is more common than we like to admit. except it usually is a temporary state of being. Have you ever tried to have a conversation with someone acting belligerent and irrational? Even when you make a logical statement, they actively refuse to listen and instead remain on a linear track of thinking and emotional behavior. This is because in that moment, you are not talking to that person. You are talking to a dominant personality just like the librarian. You are talking to a complex which has usurped the rationality of the ego. The problem is, this personality that is in control believes it to be the true expression of the individual. It believes itself to be the ego. As a result, any attack on the personality or behavior pattern is viewed as an attack on the person themselves. A lot of times, these psychological possessions occur as a self-defense mechanism. It occurs to protect the ego from internal or external threats, just like the librarian believes herself to be doing a good thing. It is Raz's job to join forces with the other versions of Cassie and remind this out-of-control defense mechanism that she is not the dominant one, only one piece of a collage of personalities that makes up the real person, one form of the shapeshifter. And so begins the boss battle with the librarian. We witness all of the self-deception and behaviors on full display which permitted this personality to remain in control. First are the enablers, summoned to protect it. Even after killing one, she refers to it as her impartial little critic. The very thing that reinforces her negative behavior patterns is viewed as an impartial voice of reason. The librarian cannot even consider that the enabler is fallible. One of her attacks is to shush Raz and blow him off the battle arena. When a personality has possessed the ego, it tries to quiet any viewpoint that conflicts with its pattern, anything that challenges its authority over the individual's mind. Finally, we have the censors. Raz is a voice that leaks through regardless of these steps, so the mind tries to stamp them out. What cannot be silenced must be exterminated. These three things create an echo chamber. You silence any dissenting voice, destroying what cannot be silenced, and give a megaphone to anything that reinforces the problematic behavior. A perfect recipe for this personality to permanently remain in control. As Raz continues the fight, the librarian comments that it is willing to destroy the entire library to keep it safe. In essence, the dominant personality intends to break Cassie herself if it means avoiding future stressors or trauma. The deeper this possession is rooted, the harder it is to remove, even to the point of self-destruction. Ultimately, the solution in the game is to facilitate a reverse possession, by cracking open the librarian personality and letting the others whittle away at it from the inside until the entire thing collapses. As soon as it does, we see this paper doll shrink in size to be the same as the rest, no longer dominant. It finally realizes what the teacher has been trying to explain to Raz. There is no real Cassie O'Pia, only a myriad of personalities that arise and recede like the tide when they are needed. If one remains at high tide permanently, she would drown beneath the waves. The paper dolls lock arms and merge back together. For the first time, Raz is face to face with Cassie in her true form.
Hi. Are you the real Cassie?
Not sure. But I'm sure she's in here somewhere.
At the end of the day, personalities that arise in response to trauma are not innately a bad thing. They do help protect us, but when they take control of the ego and refuse to give it back, they metaphorically become a demon that possesses us. The totality of the individual is lost, enabling its own control and silencing dissent out of fear that if it goes away, the ego will suffer. Now that this crisis is resolved, Cassie accompanies Raz to the Heptodome to deal with this problem. After a long period of time being controlled by the Hive, she has lost a bit of control over them. She wishes her old partner was there to give her support. And just then, he arrives.
Oh, Bully! How did you know I needed you?
A little bird told me. Oh, sorry, I should say 3 little bees.
Remember, the entire Hive obeys the unconscious will of Cassie. Even when the Queen Bee and the Librarian keep her cut off from the world, some part of her was still begging for help, for support. In this scene, it becomes evident that she isn't only his support system. Compton is her support as well, helping to keep her tethered to the world. Together, the two friends clear away the swarm from the astrolabe, leaving Raz one step closer to his goal. Next, he needs to head up the other path, crossing the vine-covered road to the greenhouse. Inside, another member of the Psychonauts has isolated himself and is silently crying out for help. See you next time in Bob's Bottles. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed, please drop a like and subscribe to receive updates on future uploads. If you would like to help support the channel, a Patreon has been set up and the link is in the description below. Have a great day and peace be with you all.